I was 22 the week I learned my parents had priced my education at $0 and my sister's at $412,000. That's not a metaphor. That's a number I would end up writing down, twice in 2 different rooms, for 2 very different reasons. I audit financial statements for a living. Forensic accounting, to be specific. The kind where you spend your days finding the number that a company hoped nobody would look at closely enough to notice. It turns out I'd been doing that job inside my own family for years. I just hadn't opened the file. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe, because this one has a paper trail longer than most. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that for 4 years, my parents' refrigerator held exactly 1 photograph, and it wasn't of me. I grew up the second of 2 daughters in a house that ran on a currency nobody ever named out loud. My sister, Renata, was the currency's reserve asset. Whatever she did was appreciating value. Whatever I did was maintenance, necessary, expected, unremarkable. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it the way I'd describe a balance sheet that's been quietly wrong for a decade. It's just what the numbers showed, if you were willing to add them. My parents were not cruel people, not in the cartoon sense. My father ran a small hardware distribution business he'd built from a single truck. My mother kept his books badly, until I started keeping them for her at 16, for free, because someone needed to and I was the one who noticed the discrepancies. That was our arithmetic. I noticed. I fixed. I absorbed. Renata went to medical school on a combination of loans, a partial scholarship, and I would later learn, a very specific instrument I did not know existed. I went to a state school on debate scholarships and a work-study job shelving library books at 6 in the morning, and I graduated first in my class summa cum laude, with a diploma that cost my parents nothing and cost me almost everything. The week before my graduation, my mother called to say they'd be stretched thin that Saturday. Renata had matched with a residency program in cardiology, and there was a party. A real one. Caterers. A tent. My father's brothers flying in from 3 states. My graduation was the same Saturday. Nobody had checked the date twice. Or maybe they had, and the arithmetic simply came out the same way it always did. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision is the only thing I trust. On the Saturday in question, I walked across a stage in a black gown with gold honor cords, in a stadium that seated 11,000 people, and exactly 4 of those seats were empty on purpose. My roommate's parents sat in 2 of them, applauding for me because mine weren't there to do it. 40 miles away, under a rented tent, my mother posted a photo to the family group chat. Renata, mid-laugh, holding a cake shaped like a stethoscope. The caption read, "So proud of our doctor. Everything we worked for." I have the screenshot. I've had it for 4 years. I didn't take it in anger. I took it out of habit, the same habit that makes me photograph every invoice before it leaves my desk. Document first. Feel later if there's time. There wasn't a comment from my father under that photo acknowledging that his other daughter had graduated first in her class that same afternoon. There wasn't a message to me at all until 9 that night when he texted, "Congrats, kiddo. Sorry we couldn't split ourselves in 2. I saved that text too. Timestamped 9:14 p.m. I would return to that number more than once. I drove home that night, my apartment, not theirs, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open to a blank document. Not to draft anything dramatic. I made a folder. I named it Family Miscellaneous. The most boring possible name for the most important file I would ever build. Inside it, I put the screenshot, the text, and a note with the date. That was all. I didn't know yet what I was building toward. I only knew, the way you know a ledger is off before you've found the error, that something here did not balance. For 3 years after that, I kept showing up. I paid for my mother's cataract surgery when my father's business had a slow quarter. I drove 2 hours each way, twice a month, to help Renata's overwhelmed parents get organized. Meaning I did their taxes and reconciled accounts my father had let drift into chaos out of pride and exhaustion. Nobody asked whether I could afford it. Nobody asked whether I minded. Calm is not the same thing as weak. My family had confused the two my entire life, and I had let them, because the alternative, saying so, felt like a bill I didn't want to be the one to send. My father died on a Tuesday in March, 11 months ago, of a heart attack in the parking lot of his own warehouse. He was 61. I flew home the same night. I planned the funeral because my mother couldn't hold a phone steady enough to dial the funeral home, and Renata was in her second year of residency. On a rotation she said she genuinely could not leave. I did not resent that. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about a woman who resented carrying weight. This is a story about what happens when you finally read the paperwork that explains why you were the one carrying it. 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother called to say the family attorney, a man named Everett Coyle, who had drafted my father's estate documents 15 years earlier and updated them twice since, wanted to meet with the family about the will. I remember thinking, good. Let's see the numbers. Everett Coyle's office was on the 4th floor of a converted textile building, the kind of space with exposed brick that law firms used to look like they've been trustworthy since before the Civil War. He sat across a walnut table from my mother, my sister's husband, and me, and he opened a leather folder with the unhurried precision of a man who has delivered this news to 100 families and learned that speed helps no one. The will itself was almost anticlimactic. My father had left the house and its contents to my mother, as expected. He'd left his half-interest in the hardware business to be sold, proceeds split between my daughters in equal shares. Equal. I noted the word. I would need it later. But then Everett Coyle turned a page, and the room's temperature changed without anyone touching the thermostat. There was a second instrument. A trust, established 9 years earlier, funded initially with $40,000 and through contributions I would later trace, invoice by invoice, to a business account that should have belonged equally to both daughters, grown to just over $412,000. The trust's stated purpose, typed in the flat legal language that makes devastating things sound administrative, was the educational and professional advancement of Renata Marisol Voss. My name did not appear in that document. Not once. Not as a beneficiary, not as a contingent beneficiary, not as a footnote. I asked Everett Coyle to read the funding history aloud. He did because that is his job, and because I asked the way I ask auditees for source documents, calmly, specifically, without room for the answer to be, I'll get back to you. Contribution after contribution, dated across 9 years, pulled from Voss Hardware Distribution's operating account. The same account I had been reconciling, without pay, since I was 16 years old. I had been balancing the very ledger that had been quietly draining into an account with my... I did not say anything for a long moment. I read the document 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, because a forensic accountant does not act on a first read. She confirms the number is real before she lets herself feel anything about it. There was a second page inside the folder, smaller, handwritten. My father's handwriting, the same cramped left-leaning script he used on invoice margins. It was a letter dated 4 years before he died, never sent, apparently kept with his private papers and handed to Everett Coyle only after his death, with instructions that it be read if it ever became necessary. It read in part, I always meant to fix the numbers. I never found the day. Tell her the ledger was never really equal, and tell her I knew it. That was the whole letter. No apology dressed up as an explanation. No excuse. Just an admission in his own hand that the imbalance had been a choice, sustained, not an oversight. I read that line and did not cry. I photographed it, the way I photograph every document that matters, and then I folded my hands on the walnut table and asked Everett Coyle one question. Whether the business's operating account records, the ones I myself had reconciled for years, were part of the estate's disclosed financial history. He said yes. I said nothing else. I thanked him and I left. I did not act that day. I went home, and I read the trust documents 3 more times, and I pulled 9 years of the business bank statements from the accounting software I had personal login credentials to, because I was the one who'd set it up. I built a spreadsheet. Then I built a second one, cross-referencing every trust contribution against a corresponding debit from the operating account, on dates that consistently preceded Renata's tuition deadlines by exactly 4 to 6 days. My father hadn't just funded my sister's education. He had funded it from money that, under the loose partnership arrangement he and I had verbally operated under for years, the one where I did the books for free for now, with vague promises of a formal role, eventually, should have been split between the value I contributed and the value she received. I had been an unpaid partner subsidizing a trust one wasn't in. I put both spreadsheets, the letter, and the trust document into the family miscellaneous folder. It now had a 4th item. I did not open it again for 6 weeks. I let it sit exactly the way you let a suspicious transaction sit before you're sure enough to flag it. My mother called first. 3 weeks after the reading, she wanted to discuss next steps for the business sale. She used the word, "we a great deal. We should get an appraiser. We should talk to Renata's husband, who knows people in commercial real estate. We should probably move quickly," she said, because Renata and her husband were counting on the timing for a down payment on a practice buy-in. I asked quietly what timing they were counting on exactly. My mother didn't have a precise answer. She had a feeling. Renata's husband had run some numbers assuming a sale price and a 50-50 split that had, apparently, already been discussed at their own kitchen table, in a conversation I was never part of, about money that was never entirely theirs to divide the way they'd already divided it in their heads. Renata came to my apartment on a Thursday evening in April, unannounced, which was itself information. She sat on my couch and told me, without preamble, that she assumed I understood the trust had been practical, because medical school was just objectively more expensive, and because her words exact. Someone in this family had to actually become something, and Dad knew that. I did not raise my voice. I asked her one question: whether she'd ever seen the account the trust contributions came from. She said she didn't know what I meant. I said that was all I needed to know for now, and I asked her to lock the door on her way out. That night, I called my attorney, not Everett Coyle, my own, a former classmate named Priya Nasser who specializes in estate and business disputes, and told her to prepare formal requests for a full accounting of the business's financial records under the partnership arrangement, along with a demand letter regarding the trust's funding source. Priya asked if I was certain. I told her I'd read the ledger 3 times. I was certain. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon for you suddenly find all the time in the world the moment money is on the table, you already know exactly where this story goes. Stick with me, because the folder isn't finished yet. 6 weeks later, my mother invited the whole family to what she called a remembrance dinner for what would have been my father's 62nd birthday. I understood immediately what it actually was. A pressure gathering, dressed as grief. I accepted. I brought a folder. The physical kind, navy blue, unremarkable, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's opened. The dinner was at my mother's house, in the same dining room where I'd done homework at that same table for 18 years while she and my father discussed Renata's college applications across from me as though I were furniture. 12 people. Aunts, an uncle, Renata's husband, my mother at the head of the table where my father used to sit. My uncle Desmond, my father's older brother and the family's self-appointed voice of reason, stood before dessert and delivered what was unmistakably a toast disguised as a verdict. He talked about legacy, about how families don't nickel and dime each other over an old man's wishes, about how the business needed to be sold cleanly, and without lawyers making it ugly, a phrase he aimed directly at me without saying my name. He raised his glass. Several people raised theirs. Renata did not look at me. She looked at her plate, which told me everything the toast did not. I asked for the floor. My mother, visibly relieved, gave it to me immediately. She believed, I could see it on her face, that I was about to surrender. I opened the Navy folder. I started with the trust document, and I read its funding purpose aloud, word for word, the way Everett Coyle had read it to us weeks earlier. Then I laid the 9 years of bank statements beside it, and I read the dates of 5 specific transfers, each one 4 to 6 days before a tuition deadline, each one drawn from the operating account I had personally reconciled without pay since I was 16 years old. I did not editorialize. I let the dates do what dates do. Desmond's face went soft first, an uncle trying to find a gentler read of numbers that had none. Then it went hard, and he said this was ancient history being weaponized. I laid my father's handwritten letter on the table next, and I read one line of it aloud, that the ledger had never really been equal, and that he had known it. Desmond had no response to a dead man's own handwriting. My mother's voice rose. She said I was trying to punish a grieving family for a father's private choices. I said, quietly, that I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply declining to sign a sale agreement that assumed I'd continue subsidizing an arrangement I had never agreed to, on the same terms I'd never agreed to it under for the past 16 years. Renata's husband threatened, loudly, that they would get their own lawyer involved, which is the sentence people say when they haven't yet understood that lawyers are already involved, and have been for 6 weeks. Renata said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, into the silence her husband's outburst had left behind, she said, "I didn't know it came from the business account. I swear I didn't know that part." It was the first true thing anyone at that table had said all evening. I acknowledged it. I did not absolve her of it. Knowing and not knowing are different debts, and she still owed hers. I closed the folder without raising my voice, and I laid one last item on the table. Not a document, but the photograph. The one from the graduation day tent. Renata mid-laugh with the stethoscope cake, printed and placed face up beside the bank statements with the corresponding withdrawal date circled in red ink. 9:14 p.m., I said quietly, was the time my father texted me an apology for missing my graduation, on the same day this photo was posted. I didn't need to explain further. The room understood exactly what number I meant, because they'd seen it circled before, in the letter, in the ledger, in every place a number had ever quietly told the truth this family preferred not to hear. Before I left, I said one sentence, and then I stood up. I kept the books for free for 16 years, because I thought that's what family costs. Turns out it was just what I was willing to be charged. Then I picked up my folder and walked out, and nobody followed me to the car. Here is how it resolved in plain numbers, because plain numbers are the only honest ending this story has. The business sold for $630,000. Under my attorney's negotiated settlement, reached without a courtroom, because my mother's own counsel advised her the funding trail was, in his words, not survivable in front of a judge. The $412,000 in the trust was recognized as an advance against Renata's share of the estate, not a separate gift. The business proceeds and the trust were reconciled together and redivided so that my total inheritance, accounting for 16 years of unpaid bookkeeping work valued at standard market rate by an independent forensic review, came to just under $500,000. Renata's total, after the trust was folded back in, came to roughly $218,000. Equal my father's will had said. It finally was. My mother and I speak now, carefully, on a schedule that resembles a supervised visitation more than a relationship, which is its own kind of honesty I can live with. Desmond sends a card at Christmas and nothing else, which is exactly the right amount of Desmond. Renata and I have spoken twice since that dinner. The second time, she asked to see the ledger herself. I let her. She sat with it for an hour and left quieter than she'd arrived. I don't know yet what that quiet will become. Some debts take longer to pay than others, and not all of them are financial. The photograph lives in the Navy folder still, in a drawer in my apartment, beside the letter in my father's handwriting. I don't look at it often. I don't need to. Some documents don't need rereading once you've understood what they prove. I use part of my share to do one thing my father never got to finish. I fully funded a scholarship at my state university, in his name, for first-generation students who work through school the way I did. Need-based, no essay about hardship required, because I never wanted anyone to have to perform their exhaustion for a committee to believe it was real. It isn't revenge. Revenge would have felt like something. This felt like paying off a debt I never agreed to carry, on my own terms for once. My father spent 9 years quietly correcting an imbalance he never had the courage to name out loud, and it cost him nothing but a signature. I spent one evening naming it, out loud, in front of everyone who'd benefited from the silence, and it cost me an entire idea of what my family was. I'd make that trade again. Some ledgers, once you finally read them all the way through, were never actually about the money. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts, and that boundaries are allowed even with your own blood, take that as your sign. Go find the folder you've been avoiding. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.